Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first session of today. We're going to have a number of really incredible presentations. I'm looking forward to hearing myself from some very, very distinguished people who will be able to tell us about programs and activities and research that is going to be essential to the issues that we're dealing with, climate change, in particular, the way the climate change is affecting World Heritage Sites. But remember, World Heritage Sites can be the canary in the coal mine. What we hear about how this will affect World Heritage Sites applies to heritage sites of all kinds. Premier heritage sites such as U.S. National Park Service or Park System services in other countries, but also a lot of very important protected areas. So I'd like to begin by introducing our first speaker for this session. The topic that he will present on is anthropogenic climate change and solutions in U.S. World Heritage Sites. This would be Dr. Patrick Gonzalez, who is now the Assistant Director for Climate and Biodiversity at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So this is a major position of influence, and we are so happy to have him here today. He is a forest ecologist and climate change scientist. He advances science-based action on human-caused climate change through research on climate change, ecosystems, wildfire, and carbon solutions and assistance to policymakers and to local people to conserve biodiversity and protect human well-being. Dr. Gonzalez is Assistant Director for Climate and Biodiversity of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. He's also an associate adjunct professor at the University of California, Berkeley, which is one of my favorite schools, just a personal favorite. He previously served as principal climate change scientist for the U.S. National Park Service. Dr. Gonzalez has conducted field research in Africa, Latin America, and the U.S. He's published in Science and other journals. He has assisted field managers and local people in 25 countries and 269 U.S. national parks. He has stood publicity for scientific integrity and broadened public understanding of climate change. In 123 published articles on his research in the New York Times and many other media. Dr. Gonzalez has served as lead author for 4 reports on the International Panel on Climate Change. The Science Panel awarded a share of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. So with that, I welcome with great enthusiasm and gratitude, Dr. Patrick Gonzalez.
Thank you very much, Douglas, and to US ICOMOS, and to everybody listening. I speak to you from Berkeley, California, which sits on the territory of Chin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. On a winter morning 33 years ago, I woke up on the floor of Yosemite Valley, and stepping out of my tent was like stepping into an Ansel Adams photograph. The brilliant white of the snow, the silver of the granite walls, and the black canopy of ponderosa pine trees. Since then, however, published scientific research using data from Yosemite has shown that anthropogenic climate change, human-caused climate change, has altered that scene. Hotter temperatures have increased wildfire, melted snowpack, and shifted plant and animal species upslope. Scientific research has found impacts of climate change in other World Heritage Sites across the US. But the US is now making progress on carbon solutions, offering hope for the future. Today, I'll Today, I'll briefly review the science of anthropogenic climate change in U.S. World Heritage Sites from published scientific research by me and others in these 5 parts. The human cause of climate change is important because it points us to the solutions. Cars, power plants, deforestation, and other human sources pump over 11 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere every year, twice as much as forests, other ecosystems, and soil can naturally absorb. This has increased carbon dioxide into the atmosphere to its highest level in 2 million years, far above the natural range of variation and any geologic cycles. You can see on the far right here, this straight line is atmospheric carbon dioxide from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution until today, a straight line that shoots up far beyond the natural range of variation. Consequently, anthropogenic climate change has increased global temperature to its highest level in over 125,000 years. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has analyzed all of the different potential causal factors and has found that human activities have caused 98% of the increased heat of climate change. These are the bars that go to the right showing heating. And the brown bar here is carbon dioxide from human activities. This small bar here is the natural sources, changes in solar irradiance. And so human-caused climate change is overwhelmingly, human activities have overwhelmingly caused climate change. Now, this increased heat is equivalent to burning one of those old 100-watt incandescent light bulbs, one of them over every square meter on Earth, day and night, continuously, at a height of a tall person. That is a lot of heat and has caused observed impacts around the world. This map shows the trend in average annual temperature across the United States, where the darkest reds here are an increase of over 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit in a century. And this research by colleagues, published by colleagues and me, showed that anthropogenic climate change has exposed the US national parks to heating at twice the national rate, because national parks are often sited in extreme environments at high elevations and in the high Arctic. We can see here the 24 World Heritage Sites in the United States. And of course, 18 of those are US national parks. Anthropogenic climate change has caused heating in many of these at greater than the global average rate. And we can see in Alaska heating of a degree per century. In Hawaii, Volcanoes National Park, 1.3 degrees per century. In San Juan National Historic Site, over 1.3 degrees per century. This map is similar, but it shows the trend in total annual precipitation, where the darkest blues are increases of 50% in a century, and the darkest browns are a decrease of 50% in a century. And again, our research showed that anthropogenic climate change disproportionately exposes the US national parks to more arid conditions, because many of the parks are located in the southwestern United States and eastern Alaska, areas that have experienced decreases in precipitation despite the overall global increase in precipitation. I'm going to show you now a series of examples from World Heritage Sites in the United States that have gone through these 2 scientific procedures of detection in attribution, detection of statistically significant changes, and attribution after examining the potential causal factors, attribution of those changes to human-caused climate change and not other factors. So these are very robust examples of human-caused climate change in World Heritage Sites. This is Muir Glacier in Glacier Bay National Park, Alaska, 1941. And keep your eye here, if you can see my cursor, on the top of the glacier, on the side of that mountain. This is 1941. And 63 years later, Muir Glacier has melted at its lowest reaches, over 640 meters, or the height of one World Trade Center. So we see here in 1941, and here the melting due to anthropogenic climate change. World Heritage Sites contribute to scientific research on climate change globally. This glacier is one of over 168,000 glaciers in a data set where the IPCC has determined that climate change has caused 2/3 of ice melt since 1991. In Chaco Canyon and across the southwestern US, anthropogenic climate change plus low periods in the precipitation cycle have caused a severe drought since 2000, the most severe since the 1500s. In Yosemite National Park and across the western US, climate change doubled the area burned by wildfire over natural levels since 1984. Wildfire is a natural and necessary part of many forests and other ecosystems, but climate change is intensifying the heat that drives wildfire and has doubled here in the orange the burning, the increase in burning over natural levels here in the yellow. In Yosemite National Park and across the western US, climate change has doubled tree mortality through 3 impacts: drought, wildfire, and bark beetle infestations. Bark beetles are also natural, but climate change has driven the most extensive infestation in 125 years. And again, in Yosemite National Park, where the increase in temperature has been at greater than the global rate, climate change has shifted subalpine forest upslope into formerly treeless subalpine meadows. At Statue of Liberty National Monument in New York City, or in New York Harbor, climate change has raised sea level 48 centimeters since 1856. That's about to your knee. And in Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument in Hawaii, climate change and across global oceans, climate change has warmed the sea surface at greater than the rate of the air temperatures. Water temperatures have increased 1.2 degrees Celsius since 1910. And again, in Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument and across tropical reefs, ocean acidification has corroded or dissolved corals. The increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere dissolves in water and forms a weak carbonic acid, which lowers the pH, which increases an increase of acidity. And in fact, climate change has increased acidity 40% in Pacific Ocean waters since the Industrial Revolution. Okay, those were all historical observed impacts that have already occurred in World Heritage Sites in the United States. Now I'm going to show you examples of what might occur with continued emissions of carbon pollution from human activities. And in fact, with no emissions reductions, climate change could regrettably raise global temperature to its highest level in 50 million years, astounding. Yet cutting carbon emissions, cutting carbon pollution would limit those temperature increases. And in fact, meeting the Paris Agreement goals, we can still limit the temperature increase to 1.5 to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. This graph shows temperature on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis. In Mesa Verde National Park and across the southwestern US, continued climate change increases drought risks up to the 1% driest historical conditions. And in Taos Pueblo, and again, across the United States, continued climate change could increase fire frequencies up to 5 times historical levels, particularly in the Northern Rockies and in the Northern Great Lakes. Specifically, in Yellowstone National Park, climate change could increase fire frequency an astounding 300 to 1,000% under the highest emissions scenario with no emissions reductions. Sea level rise under the highest emissions scenario could raise sea level over 70 centimeters in Everglades National Park, inundating half of the land area of the existing park. And in Grand Canyon National Park, climate change could reduce Colorado River flow up to half by mid-century. And this occurs through a reduction in snow cover in the upper Colorado River basin, and also increased evapotranspiration from the heat of anthropogenic climate change. In Wrangell St. Elias National Park and Preserve, climate change is increasing the risk of destruction of cultural artifacts like these basket fragments and these projectile points, which have been locked in glaciers and ice, but are exposed upon melting and can be degraded and destroyed very quickly upon exposure. And at Falling Water in the amazing design by Frank Lloyd Wright in Pennsylvania and in other historic buildings, climate change increases the risk of weathering and deterioration of historic materials. Okay, so I'm going to show you briefly a few resilience measures, a few measures that the National Park Service and others are taking. These examples are actually from sites outside of the World Heritage Network, including a Joshua Tree National Park, where the park has used scientific research here in the lower right that identifies potential refugia, or areas that are potentially more stable under future climate change. And they concentrate their wildfire management and invasive species control and other conservation measures in those refugia. On the Yurok Reservation near Redwood National Park, near a World Heritage Site, and across the United States, 2 practices of prescribed burning and letting natural fires burn can restore natural fire to the landscape and reduce risks of high severity fire under climate change. And in Biscayne National Park and in other tropical areas, scientists and conservation managers are starting to raise local corals that are resistant to bleaching, raise them in underwater nurseries to outplant and increase the resilience of coral reefs. Okay, so we've seen a lot of bad news, and I'm going to conclude the presentation with good news: carbon solutions that attack the cause of climate change. And the US Climate Alliance of 24 states and Puerto Rico has cut greenhouse gas emissions 14% since 2005, on track to meet the Paris Agreement goal. And this is through energy efficiency, energy conservation, and renewable energy, like this wind farm in California. The state of California has been advanced and has cut greenhouse gas emissions below 1990 levels 4 years before the state goal. And again, through measures like this solar panel on a maintenance building at Yosemite National Park. The US national parks conserve the ecosystems with the highest carbon per square on the ground in the world, in and near a World Heritage Site, Redwood National Park. And conserving the forest prevents that carbon from going into the atmosphere and causing climate change. Conserving tropical forests from deforestation could reduce global carbon emissions 15%, and the United Nations, which meets next week, has included this program of reducing emissions from deforestation in the global effort to take action on climate change. And in the United States, transport causes more carbon pollution than any other sector. So walking, biking, and taking public transit, which can cut your carbon emissions up to 99%, is an important action that you individually can take to help conserve World Heritage Sites. And your individual action contributes to concerted global action that the IPCC has determined can still attain the Paris Agreement goal of limiting warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. So your actions can help conserve the World Heritage Sites in the United States for future generations. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much. That's very enlightening. It's a little disturbing, I must say, but it's very enlightening. And I think that the fact that we're disturbed by what you're saying is something of an incentive to take action. I've got a lot of questions that I'm not going to ask right now, but I would even like to ask you some questions, perhaps on one-on-one at a certain point in time. But we're going to have to move on right now. And our next speaker is going to be Dr. Will Megarry, who happens to be the ICOMOS focal point for climate change and cultural heritage and senior lecturer at Queen's University Belfast. He's an archaeologist. He's a geographical information systems and heritage management specialist with over 15 years commercial and academic experience. He's published widely on all of these sorts of things. I think it's very notable that he is now the ICOMOS focal point on climate change and heritage. There's so much more to say, and we don't have time really to talk about William's accolades. Just a couple of them. He's a pisco sour connoisseur. He's a staunch supporter of the Baltimore Orioles, when, as we all know, there are tragically few of these people these days. So, and he's an excellent human being. I'll just leave it at that. You can read his bio online, and I will turn this over to Professor William Megarry.
Thank you, Doug. Wow, what a fabulous introduction. And I trust you're enjoying a few nice pisco sours in Peru yourself. Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, in my case, from Northern Ireland. I'd like to start today's presentation just by thanking the organisers for inviting me to speak to you all today. I'm going to be speaking today on a project which was launched in 2020 called Heritage on the Edge, which was a collaboration between ourselves in the ICOMOS Working Group for Climate Change and Cultural Heritage, Google Arts and Culture, and SciArc. And I'd especially like to acknowledge at this point some of my colleagues from this project, in particular Casey Haddock from SciArc, who I worked very closely with throughout it. I'm going to explain a little bit about the background to the project, which was launched in January 2020, just before the global pandemic hit and everything changed. And what I'm going to do is just give some background to what the project was about before we actually look at reviewing what its possible impact was, both using web metrics from 6 months after the launch, and also some debriefing interviews which we did with stakeholders. So the project itself was envisioned at the 42nd session of the World Heritage Committee meeting in Bahrain. At this meeting was the first face-to-face get-together of the Climate Change and Cultural Heritage Working Group in ICOMOS. And one of the key themes which had emerged from our discussions during this week was that climate change is not only under threat from cultural heritage is not only under threat from climate change, but it's also actually an asset in our response to climate change. This included the communicative power of iconic heritage to promote climate action and increase ambition. And at this same meeting, a group of us from the working group met up with a group of people from SciArc, and the idea for Heritage on the Edge was born. The basic idea of the project is fairly straightforward, and that is that for many, the topic of climate change can be quite overwhelming, and people very quickly can get lost in a sea of complex terminology. But heritage, the things we care about, are about people, and they're about things that are important to people. And as such, it humanizes the conversation and creates a lens through which we can understand these wider issues in a more accessible way. And that's essentially what the Heritage on the Edge project is trying to do. So I have posted a link to the project in the chat, which I hope everybody can see, or if you have one of those fancy phones that can scan a QR code, you can go and look at it. But basically the goals of the project are presented on the slide, but in a nutshell, it was about using technology, using web, using storytelling from iconic heritage sites around the world to tell people and inform people about the wider impacts of climate change. It was also important that the project would be a genuine collaboration between ourselves and our project partners, and that any data which we created would be of use to them in their ongoing monitoring and adaptation efforts. The process for selecting sites began with a long list which was submitted by project partners, and conversations were then had with relevant stakeholders, including World Heritage Site managers, and ICOMOS national committees and international scientific committees. And these conversations really helped us to gauge interest, but also to start building initial narratives, initial stories that we wanted to tell. And just to stress that this was not a linear process. The whole project was planned, delivered, and launched within about 18 months. And so there were plenty of times when we were on site in one place, but actually communicating with other sites at another. In the end, these 5 sites were chosen from a much longer long list, and they were Rapa Nui National Park, Chan Chan Archaeological Complex in Peru, the ruins of Kilwa Kisawani and the ruins of Songo Manora in Tanzania, the old and new towns of Edinburgh, and the historic mosque city of Bagarhat in Bangladesh. Now, as aforementioned, the sites represented both a geographical distribution, but also a range of climate impacts, and this was really important to meet the aims of the project. Impacts included increased precipitation and storminess in Edinburgh to more erratic weather in Peru. Coastal erosion was a key impact at 2 sites, at Rapa Nui and in Kilwa Kisawani and Songo Manora. And equally important as the impacts and the locations were the local stories and the climate-related cross-cutting themes. And these included telling stories about things like nature-based solutions, examples of successful carbon mitigation, and also the value of new tools and methodologies to monitor and adapt to the impacts of climate change. And just to illustrate this process and the process of narrative development, I'd like to explore very briefly one of the lesser known sites in the project and how the site story evolved. And this city is the historic mosque city of Bagarhat in Bangladesh. So the site is a wonderful example of both past and present climate adaptation. It was built in the 15th century on the edge of the Sundarbans, which is a vast riverine delta at the top of the Bay of Bengal. And in this, just a challenging landscape really from the outset, and its designer used materials that were sympathetic to the environment, including using stone foundations and then building on top of those stone foundations to deal with the high water table in the area. It was inscribed in the World Heritage List in 1985, and it continues to be a living site and landscape, which is central to both local and also Bangladeshi national identity. As such, the history of the site remains deeply ingrained in the present, allowing us to explore the intersection between heritage and local values. Now, the impact affecting Bagarhat is less direct and clear and well known than maybe other climate impacts. Rising sea levels across Bangladesh are resulting in increased salinity of fresh water. And this is having both significant health impacts on people in the area, but it's also damaging sites like Bagarhat through a process called efflorescence, where saline intrusion in the water table results in salt forming on the structures of these monuments. So the narrative of the story of Bagarhat involved combinations of both past and present elements, an understanding of the different values of the site, both archaeologically, historically, and socially, and also exploring a less well understood climate impact. Of course, these narratives evolved throughout the project due in part to the data which we were able to collect during fieldwork. And fieldwork teams consisted of members of SIARC, a member of the ICOMOS working group, and also local and national and regional experts who were brought in for interviews at the sites. At 4 out of the 5 sites, 2-day workshops were held for local heritage professionals, and these explored themes like climate adaptation and also digital recording techniques. The actual data fieldwork, the collection, generally took between 5 and 7 days and was focused on various aspects of data capture. So as Doug mentioned, I'm a passionate believer in geospatial technologies, and the 3D recording and presentation of data, including terrestrial laser scanning of extant features, were chosen based both on their vulnerability and their iconic nature. Both drone and handheld photogrammetry using a structure from motion pipeline was also used to create texture and capture more difficult to reach parts of the sites. This data then enabled the SIARC team to create 3D models which could then be shared on the Google Arts and Culture platform through a project website. These models were quite light, which meant they were accessible to people even with quite poor internet. And visitors could then explore these devices and even use some of the more advanced functionality available through the Arts and Culture website, like, for example, exploring some key sites in augmented reality. And any of you who have not tried this on your phone, I strongly recommend downloading the Google Arts and Culture app and doing this, because what you'll find is that these buildings appear in the middle of your living room, and as you walk around them, you can actually explore them. It really is quite incredible. Equally, if not more important than the 3D models, were the interviews with local stakeholders, and these ranged from site managers and custodians to members of the local community, tour guides, and climate scientists. In total, we recorded over 100 hours of interview footage from 5 sites. And this footage importantly attempted not just to capture the linear narrative of climate impacts, but also other stories which evolved throughout the project. So, for example, stories of adaptation at sites and the importance of sites locally, and also focusing on broader site values. These interviews were then edited and presented on the website in both audio and video forms, and quotations from interviews were then also taken out and used to tell some of our stories in more detail. In all cases, these interviews enhanced and expanded our existing narratives considerably, taking the project to different and often surprising places. And in the final few months of the project, we focused on quality assurance and content review with in-country partners. All interviews were transcribed and where relevant translated, and local partners commented on drafts of the texts. Climate science experts were checked by climate scientists, and we employed a graphics company to create and edit infographics and promotional videos for the project as a whole and for different sites and themes. So for example, for our Rapa Nui exhibit, we created a series of infographics which identified and attempted to communicate the different coastal hazards impacting the historic Mari. Prior to the launch, all content was translated into French and Spanish, and quite importantly, the Bagarhat and Kilwa pages were translated into Bangla and Swahili for local audience. There was a small event in London for the launch, but the vast majority of publicity was done online through media engagement, interviews, and press releases from different organizations. And we were very fortunate to get the coveted Google hyperlink, the Google search hyperlink, that little hyperlink that appears below the Google search box, which brought a lot of people to the site. It received really positive feedback, and it was really great to see this come through. Now, while the project release involved a lot of this media and promotional plan, COVID very quickly became the dominant topic, and I think we definitely saw numbers and interest drop off as a result. But given that the goal of the project was actually to communicate climate urgency using cultural heritage, it was important to explore its impact after the launch and not just to leave it there. We wanted to see whether or not we'd actually had any effect. And while popularity does not necessarily correspond to impact or people changing their ways of thinking or doing things, it is possible to harvest from data analytics a range of information, which I think can give us some indication as to how successful we were. And so 6 months after the launch, we undertook a thorough analysis of these analytics, which included, amongst others, information on where people were viewing from, their viewing devices, and how long they actually stayed on the web pages. Of course, this doesn't necessarily tell us much about how local communities felt about the site and about the project, and that was covered subsequently in interviews, which I'll come to in just a minute. So the analytics told us that in the first 6 months, 250,000 people visited the portal, and the majority of these came from the Anglophone world in North America, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. Unfortunately, there were far fewer views from Africa and Southeast Asia, and rather unsurprisingly, the two most popular sites were the two best known, so Edinburgh Castle and Rapa Nui. Breaking down the viewing location by site, we can see some regional factors coming across. More iconic sites continue to receive more global attention, but some of the more regional local sites like Bagarhat and Kilwa Kisawani do see extra traffic from people in the African and Southeast Asian regions. So while these locations can tell us where people are viewing from, they can't necessarily tell us about levels of engagement. But thankfully, another analytical tool is how long people stayed and actually looked at the individual page. And our project had two types of exhibits: assets, which were smaller. They were things like videos, photos, interviews, stuff like that, and also stories. What was interesting is when we looked at the difference between assets and stories, and we see that people are spending quite a bit of time on both. So assets, people are spending just under a minute, but with stories, the average viewing time is actually just over 2 minutes. And these were 500-word long narratives, which went into more detail. These were really the meat of what we were trying to communicate to people. So this strongly suggests that viewers were engaging meaningfully with the project. Another analytical tool we were able to get out of these analytics was to see how people were looking at it. And this is interesting because if you want to have reach, we have to understand that people access these things differently. The Heritage on the Edge program scales to your phone as well as on your laptop. And these analytics showed us that while the majority of people in Europe, North America, and Australia were viewing this via desktop computer, the vast majority of people elsewhere were actually accessing this through their mobile phones. So like I said before, and this is my second last slide, these analytics are really interesting in showing global patterns. And they allow us to explore, or at least hypothesize, about the potential impact of this project to the people viewing online. But they don't necessarily tell us as to how useful these projects were for the communities. And if you'll remember, that was a key part of what we want to do. And I think it's very important with projects like this, especially projects which go to different countries around the world, to be quite critical and see what we did well and what we did badly. So we undertook interviews with 4 out of 5 of our project partners. And the impression we got was that while we did some things very well, there were other things that we didn't do well, other things that we'd really need to improve on in the future. So the tight time frame of the project, for example, meant that we often had to turn things around quite quickly. Organization happened quite last minute, and this created issues for local partners. Local partners also really enjoyed the training aspects of this. And I think in the future, we would need to invest significantly more heavily in making sure that training is meaningful, but also sustainable. And part of that is because of the final aspect, which is technology. And there are 2 parts to this here. The first is about kit. We use both standard cameras and laser scanners, but laser scanners are beyond the reach of many sites, even in our own countries. And so in order for these techniques to be sustainable, for sites to be able to continue using them, we need to make sure that they are equipped with the technology and the skills necessary to do that. And the final part in technology is perhaps for me the most important, which is that at 2 of these sites in Tanzania and Bangladesh, the level of input and the level of engagement in the websites from local communities was virtually non-existent. So we had gone to these places, we had run a project, and really nobody from the community was able to access it due to a lack of internet access or a lack of technology to be able to do it. And I think if we were going to do this again, we will put significantly more effort into translating our results into a medium and into a way that would allow local communities to engage and enjoy them further. So in conclusion, 2 main points. The first is that care must be taken not to use places at the expense of local communities and custodians. And one way to ensure this is to ensure that we are starting and creating ongoing relationships with these sites. It will be important to stress at this point that projects, follow-on projects of substantially more funding have continued out of 3 out of these 5 sites and are continuing to this point. So this project acted as a platform, as a springboard for much more detailed projects, much more suited to what many of our partners wanted to do. And secondly, that the Heritage on the Edge project, I think, clearly illustrates that iconic sites do have power to increase awareness about climate change and stress climate urgency. So thank you all for your time. And I'd like to thank all the people on this slide here, without whom this project would not have been possible. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. That was fascinating and wide-ranging and all very pertinent. So thank you so much. I think we're running a bit short on time now, so I'd like to introduce the next speaker and presentation. The topic is World Heritage Site Vulnerability to Climate Change. Steps taken at San Juan National Historic and World Heritage Site by Myrna Palfrey. And this is something that came up actually in the first set of Q&As. Myrna is a native of Bamiyan, Puerto Rico, and began her tenure with the National Park Service there as a clerk in 1987 at San Juan National Historic Site, beautiful site. She moved to Fort Pulaski National Memorial in Georgia, Canaveral National Seashore in Florida, and Chazamel National Memorial in Texas. Her first park superintendency of Palo Alto Battlefield National Historic Site was in Texas. She returned to the Southeast region in 2006 to serve as Deputy Superintendent at Florida's Biscayne National Park before becoming Canaveral National Seashore Superintendent in 2010. And that's quite a varied career and some wonderful places. So there's much more I could say about Superintendent Palfrey, but I think it will just be better to move on to her presentation. I welcome you and invite you to begin.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for allowing me this opportunity to speak about the San Juan National Historic Site and what we have been able to do and plan to do towards meeting all the many challenges that are ahead of us due to climate change. So a few important milestones. In 1949, we're established as the San Juan National Historic Site. In In 1983, we received designation as a World Heritage Site. And in 2016, there were minor adjustments made to that heritage site property. It included the addition of several historic walls and bastions, the esplanade of El Morro, that's the grounds right in front of El Morro, and we'll see some pictures here shortly, and just really completing the World Heritage Site property. I also want to highlight here the 1995. There, we built El Paseo del Morro National Recreation Trail. It was constructed at a cost of about 40 million. And I just wanted to highlight this because this trail, which surrounds the fort of El Morro, right on the coastline, is a very significant project in that it directly addresses the vulnerability of the fort against climate change due to erosion. So we're a small island. There you see it in the square there. It's located within the Caribbean hurricane belt. So we have a 6-month hurricane season from June to November. The island itself, it's 100 miles long by about 35 miles wide. So that gives us 300 miles of coastline. So therefore, climate change and sea level rise are significant concerns. So we're surrounded at the north and east of the island by the Atlantic Ocean and the southwest by the Caribbean Sea. Okay, on this aerial, what I wanted to show was San Juan is an islet. So this is the islet of San Juan, and this is the mainland, if you will, of Puerto Rico. So we're connected by this bridge. So also over here, you have the San Juan Bay. And over here, this island is called Goat Island, Isla de Cabras. And we have also a fort sitting here, which is also park jurisdiction. So looking at this area right here is where our jurisdiction starts, where the park begins. This is San Cristobal, Fort San Cristobal. And there is what we call the North Wall, a historic wall all through this, right on the coastline. The park continues, takes a little bit, a dip south, and we continue here. This is also our North Wall. This is also a historic wall. And then we go back to the coastline, and all of this area here is El Morro, Fort San Felipe del Morro. And these are the esplanade we were talking about that was added to the World Heritage Site. So, as you see, in the 1995 trail that I referred to is all this that surrounds the fort, protecting that coastline. And the park continues through the coast, continues all the way here. And just about here is the San Juan Gate. And that's where our jurisdiction stops for just a bit though, because then you continue here. This is Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. This area that's covered by clouds on this aerial, that is the governor's mansion. That is La Fortaleza. And right here, La Fortaleza is also part of the World Heritage Site. And San Juan National Historic Site, then jurisdiction or park jurisdiction continues through here. Another row of what we call our South Wall, and it continues historic walls that go all the way to about here. And so across the bay, you have, like I said, El Fortín San Juan de la Cruz. It's better known as El Cañuelo. Talk a little bit about that, a little bit more about that, right? And so this is Isla de Cabras, Goat Island, a 1994 aerial and a 2003. So the shoreline at the beach of El Cañuelo and around the fort is this point right here. This here is the fort right here. And so the shoreline at the beach of El Cañuelo and around the fort has experienced significant erosional issues and loss of shoreline and beach width. The island sustained significant damage during Hurricane Maria in 2017. And as you can see here, the 94 and 2003 aerials. So we have started a project for a shoreline protection system at El Cañuelo. The project is for 2.1 million, and it includes installation of about 400 linear feet of rock revetment. And that would be placed all through this area here. And that's going to allow us to regain approximately 20 to 40 feet of shoreline. Also, the creation of an earthen berm around the fort at a crest elevation of about 6 feet above mean sea level. Also elevating about 15,000 square feet of surrounding land to make it 5 feet above mean sea level. The pointer keeps going off the screen. Here we go. So development of the project took into consideration climate change and sea level rise estimates, and is expected to have at least a 25-year design life. A couple more pictures. Here you see El Morro. This is El Morro. This here is the trail surrounding El Morro. Then Castillo San Cristobal. Castillo San Cristobal is the largest fortification in the National Park Service. Here you have a picture of the city wall. This is the San Juan Gate I was telling you about. And this here, you can see the width and get a better view of the trail around El Morro. This is a very comfortable, very popular trail. If you look over here, this building that you have, this little portion here, that is the governor's mansion. That's La Fortaleza. So the park goes up to here, and then this begins Commonwealth jurisdiction. And over here, this is El Cañuelo, the fort on Isla de Cabras, Goat Island. So you have El Morro, the Bay of San Juan, and El Cañuelo. And El Cañuelo, you can see here, it's about 3 feet above mean sea level and is subject to coastal flooding. It is the park asset with the greatest exposure and likely the highest vulnerability. So when Secretary Holland was speaking, she mentioned a couple of projects that we have already completed. The restoration of the San Fernando Bastion that is right above the trail of El Morro. And that has been restored. That was through Great American Outdoors Act funding. Also the restoration of historic walls. We have an expert team of masons. We have expert mason workers, mason leaders. These folks go throughout the nation to train other teams, and they're just very effective. Just a top-notch program that we have here for historic wall preservation, mason preservation work. But apart from that, and the Morro Trail, the Cañuelo project, I wanted to focus on these two efforts, the climate-friendly parks program and our first vulnerability assessment. So let's talk first about the climate-friendly parks program. So as you can see here, this is what the program focused on. And really the focus was on addressing how to further integrate sustainability into park operations. So we're looking at the impacts of our operations on the environment and how we can minimize our contribution to climate change. So the park wanted to better understand how we could improve our operations to reduce our carbon footprint. And these are the main areas you see here, the main areas of focus that we wanted to address at that time. So through the Climate Friendly Parks program, the main lesson that we learned was this is great information to have. There's many corrective actions and initiatives that we have to take. But the main thing is that we learned more about the concept of vulnerability assessment as it related to climate change and our great need to complete a thorough assessment. So here, this is interesting. So this map shows a 50-year projection of inundation. It shows that both the yellow and the red areas, they'll all be inundated. The yellow areas will be subject to inundation by the 1% annual chance flood event, all the yellow areas. Now the red areas also would be inundated by the 1% chance flood event, but also by additional hazards due to storm-induced velocity wave action. So as you can see, the Isla of San Juan and Isla de Cabras, Goat Island. So this is the 50-year projection. So now let's talk a little bit about the vulnerability assessment. So we learned, of course, with the Climate Friendly Parks program that we really needed to dig deeper and complete a more detailed assessment. Now the assessment is science-based. It's our first approach, our first look at the vulnerabilities associated with climate change at the park. And we understand that the assessment is not the perfect tool and that it had some flaws. Two things that I'll highlight. So two of the things that, of the flaws of the assessment. The assessment only considered park assets, so assets within the parks, our buildings and our trails within the park. So this completely leaves out the roads leading to the park that are located in areas where we have severe erosion problems, areas of the city that flood easily already. And so remember, we're on an islet, so flooding could mean there's absolutely no access to the park or to the site. And also, the assessment considered El Morro, the Fort of El Morro, as one unit. And so it did this because it based, the data that was used was based on the National Park Service maintenance management program. And that program considers El Morro as one unit. And so El Morro has 6 levels. The lower level, like the floating battery, of course, it would obviously be more severely impacted than higher levels, but the fort is given one single rate. And so these were the coastal hazards that were assessed for determining our vulnerability. And so the assessment is done and it's completed. The results, we had the results for the vulnerability of our buildings. We had 6 buildings with high vulnerability and 3 with moderate vulnerability. Now, the main fortifications of El Morro and San Cristobal Fort, El Morro was rated as moderate vulnerability, and the San Cristobal was rated as low. Now, different from El Morro, the San Cristobal Fort had these 3 areas. The data did allow for San Cristobal, when they entered, or when the data that they used from the management system of the Park Service did not treat this entirely as one unit for San Cristobal. So you have the fort general as a unit was considered low vulnerability, but these 3 high areas were considered high. Having problems here with these 3 points here. And so again, the assessment based, the formula used for vulnerability was exposure plus sensitivity equals vulnerability, where exposure, of course, is it located in an area experiencing impacts of climate change, and sensitivity. Sensitivity was how the asset fares exposed to those impacts. So 9 out of those 35 buildings were either high or moderate, or 25% of our buildings and our structures. So among these was El Cañuelo and El Morro. And as you all know, these buildings are integral parts of the fortification system and are contributing to the outstanding universal value that gives the historic site its character as a World Heritage Site. Also, there were 2 trails that were rated as moderate risk. The trail of El Paseo del Morro, and this trail here known as Recinto Oeste. So those 2 trails were moderate vulnerability. And again, the assessment did not measure the vulnerability of other roads or transportation routes of our surroundings, which, as we talked, were an islet, so those roads are necessary to reach us. The designation of the park's transportation infrastructure is misleading, since the roads leading to the site are located in high-risk areas or areas that may be underwater if the trends persist. And I believe this is my last slide, and I just wanted to list some thoughts as we move forward. Definitely, the park needs to expand vulnerability assessments. We need to update information or have an assessment that has not only the information from the National Park Service's facility management system, but all there's information, and what I'm considering is information such as the condition of these walls that have been, the patchwork has been completed. There's miles of walls where the condition has improved tremendously. And just there's other aspects that the maintenance management system does not include that we need to include as part of this formula. And for this updated assessment, we're in conversations with the National Park Service's Center for Preservation, Technology, and Training. And what we are working on is completion of an assessment that includes a computer simulated 3D digitized model of the results. And we feel this would allow us and our community to better understand and clearly visualize the effects of climate change on our resources, but also on the entire islet of San Juan. And our next step for that project is, of course, to secure funding. We also want to continue pursuing Great American Outdoors or legacy restoration funds for a project that we have already submitted. It's a $58 million project that would, in essence, connect to the existing trail at El Morro and serve to protect the coastal assets and that fortification through El Morro, the little bit that remains at El Morro, continue east and continue all the way to Fort San Cristobal. The estimate is $58 million, and we'll continue to try to, we'll pursue trying to obtain those funds. And of course, develop updated funding requests as per the findings of the updated assessment, and continue implementing all that we've learned through the Climate Friendly Parks program. And so that is my presentation. I thank you, and I look forward to answering any questions that may come up.
Thank you so much, Myrna. That was fascinating. These have been really fascinating presentations, but I would like to reserve some time for a Q&A and a little bit of discussion. This presentation is entitled Anthropogenic Activities in Changing Landscape in Ngorongoro Conservation Area in Northern Tanzania. Charles is a professor at the University of Colorado, Denver. He did his undergraduate studies at the J.W. Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany. He got his PhD in 1999 from the University of Chicago. He also organized a 2 million euros funded project from the European Union to valorize Tanzania's cultural heritage and to construct a new museum, which we had a chance to see a few years ago. Beautiful. And community center at Olduvai Gorge, in collaboration with the organization that is really in charge of managing Ngorongoro, the Ngorongoro Conservation Area Authority. Charles is also, and we're thankful for this, a trustee of US ICOMOS, and also a board member of a Denver-based Africa School Assistant Project organization that builds schools in Tanzania. And again, there's so much more that one could say about Charles, but I'll mention that if your Land Rover ever gets stuck in the Serengeti and it's getting dark and the lions are coming out, you will want to be with Charles. So with that introduction, I invite Charles to speak.
Doug, thank you very much for a kind sort of introduction. I would actually first, I would like to say good afternoon or good evening for everyone who is actually attending the symposium, or good morning, depending on which part of the world you are on right now. But I also like to acknowledge that I'm actually talking from the University of Colorado in Denver. And I'd like to acknowledge the fact that we honor and acknowledge that the University of Colorado's 4 campuses are on a traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. And further, we also acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now called Colorado. With further ado, I'd like to share with you some work which actually Doug and I, after that incidences with getting stuck in the Ngorongoro Conservation Area, after our first, I think, ICOM meeting in Africa, which Doug and I, we co-organized, we started sort of brainstorming about some projects and looking at some issues which we thought that could be of interest for us to actually look at. And then, of course, that ended up becoming a small project which has actually produced some really interesting data on changes in the vegetation and land cover within the Ngorongoro conservation area due to anthropogenic effects. So Ngorongoro conservation is actually a World Heritage Site, which was actually, first it was established in 1959 as a multiple land use conservation area, which is probably one of the only on the African continent. And it was later inscribed as a World Heritage Site and natural criteria 7 for aesthetics and 9 for ecological processes and 10 for biodiversity. Basically, it has probably one of the few places in the world where you can actually find some higher concentration of land mammals on this planet. There are over 3,000 species of both plants and animals, which actually live in the Ngorongoro Conservation Area. And of course, in 2010 was further expanded on the World Heritage List as a site of cultural significance under cultural criteria 4. But the NCA, since its establishment in 1959, has experienced an increase in number of inhabitants from 30,000 people to about over 70,000 people in 2019. And that increase, of course, it's noticeable in a sense, but there are also other threats to the site, and that includes also others, such as, for instance, of course, population increase is one, but also livestock increase. So the inhabitant of the Ngorongoro Conservation Area, who are the majority, actually the Maasai people, they are nomadic pastoralists, which actually now have actually sort of permanently settled in the Ngorongoro Conservation Area. And of course, tourism, increased numbers of tourism activities, and also the decline of carnivore, which actually sort of, we are putting checks and balances on the population increase of browsers and grazers. And of course, the last one is invasive species of plants, which actually have been introduced by sheer accident, by either anthropogenic activities or also natural sort of migratory animals from other parts of the Serengeti. So here's the Ngorongoro Conservation Area, and it's really very famous for some of us who are in the field of paleoanthropology. It's a site which actually produced in 1959 the very first human ancestors, which was actually dubbed as Zinjanthropus poesiae by the Leakeys. But it also has actually produced other remains, including remains of Australopithecus afarensis and remains of Homo habilis and Homo erectus, and also anatomically modern humans. So as a paleoanthropological site, it's very, very important as well. And also without forgetting, probably only one of the few sites in the world which actually also preserves the earliest evidence of the evolution of upright posture and bipedalism in humans, the Laetoli footprints, which are dated to about 3.6 million years old. But as I said before, we actually sort of, in 2017, we were actually sort of visiting the Ngorongoro Conservation, looking at some of the archaeological sites within the crater. And then Doug and I, we started talking about chances of actually looking at using satellite imagery to help the Ngorongoro Conservation answer some big questions. So the biggest question which we had was whether we could actually detect anthropogenic induced vegetational changes within the NCA using normalized difference vegetation index, NDVI. And if that was the case, then how are these analysis helpful to the Ngorongoro Conservation Area Authority? And of course, today we know the Ngorongoro Conservation is actually sort of, it is at a crossroad because it has to try to balance between either moving a portion of people from the area to, and relocating them to other places, or actually not doing much. So these are some of the questions which probably could help both the Ngorongoro Conservation and the analysis which we actually did, though preliminary. We thought it actually sort of was so compelling and could actually help policymakers and managers at the Ngorongoro Conservation Area to actually make informed decisions about the future of this site. And of course, the other thing which we were interested in trying to figure out how we could actually develop the analysis and visualization to make them more useful to the NCA management. So here we worked in collaboration with the Cultural Site Research and Management Foundation, which actually sort of was under the directorship of Doug, and also collaborated with the Ngorongoro Conservation Area Authority as well. So the material methods for the analysis, we used, of course, normalized different NDVI as a measure of vegetation to actually try to figure the health of the vegetation. And of course, we also looked into trying to come out with the best sort of vegetation classification index, which we can actually use. And in this case, we're interested in trying to figure out what type of vegetation covers can actually be observed from the area. And from the forested highlands of the Ngorongoro volcanic highlands to the plains where actually grasses and shrubs could actually be seen, as well as we were interested in looking at some of the anthropogenic indicators, and that was actually dwellings or villages. We looked at the Maasai bomas, and those actually did help in trying to figure out a little bit more about our analysis. We also looked into water, standing water, and looking where the lakes, ponds, water holes, and how have they actually grown, shrunk, or moved over time. So we are looking into changes, if we could detect changes in the landscape, and sort of using this multispectral data. So we used, of course, the multispectral data to detect and detect and also make classification of the vegetation changes. And then, of course, we used Landsat 8 operational land imager, L8 OLI, and Landsat 7, the enhanced thematic mapper class, to create NDVI images to analyze vegetation health in and around Ngorongoro Conservation Area. And this actually happened. We looked at data from 2000 to 2017. And of course, we like to expand this study to probably up to about 2020, and if we be able to get some funding to actually sort of work on that. So here are the data sensors we used for the study, and with Landsat 7 with enhanced ETM plus with a temporal resolution of about 16 days, with a spatial resolution of about 30 meters, with level 2 surface reflectance products downloaded from USGS Explorer, as well as Landsat 8 operational land imager with a temporal resolution of about 16 days as well, and a spatial resolution of 60 meters with level 2 surface reflectance as well. And also we've also looked into using Sentinel-2A multispectral instrument with a temporal resolution of about 10 days. And this has a variable sort of spatial resolution in which bands 2 to 4 has got about 10 meters, and bands 5, 7, and 8A, 11, and then 12, they're about 20 meters. And also we looked into bands 1, 9, and 10, which are 60 meters. And also, similarly, we use the surface reflectance products created using ESA sensor tool, coordinator tool on our end. And this work was done in a DAG's lab. So the NDVI index used basically in this equation was much straightforward. We looked at the near infrared band and sort of subtracted it to the red band and divided it, of course, with the near infrared band and plus the red band. And to measure, and as we use it to measure basically vegetational health and classifying vegetational cover within and around the NCA. And here's some of the equations and the values, which I'm not going to get into details a lot, but I would like to actually to share some of the preliminary results which we actually had. And so here part of the how the equation were actually sort of delivered and how we actually were able to actually use some of these stack and calculate NVI pixel statistics in ArcMap and the QGIS. So these are the two software products which we actually used. But now I'm sharing here a little bit some of the results, and you can see here in which, for instance, and then let me see if I could use my spotlight. There we go. So this area here is called actually the Northern Highlands and the Ngorongoro Northern Highlands, which is characteristically sort of typical of highland montane forests, so-called East African montane forests. And then here we get the crater floor, and the crater floor is actually typical, sort of characterized by Lake Magadi, and as well as just typical sort of Serengeti plains with sort of acacia trees. And then, of course, on the Western Depression over here, this is actually the area where we got the Ngorongoro, the Olduvai Gorge. That's here, it's the main gorge, and there's the side gorge. We saw the archaeological sites. And the farther south here, we actually can see this is actually Laetoli, close to Lake Eyasi, down this area. And so basically by looking at data collected during the rain season and dry season, we're actually able to detect some changes in vegetation cover. Let's see if I could advance this. And here, so of course, to be able to do that, we use sort of percent change algorithm to actually derive a simple measure. And that actually worked very well. And as we can see here, we can look into whether there were actually sort of some trends in which actually sort of vegetation changes were actually occurring. And we can see on this image up on the left, on my left side here, we can see some of these changes, either during the rain, sort of the rain season, or during the dry season. And these changes are actually sort of drastic when we start to look at them. And we actually ended up looking at it and even more within the close to the sites by looking at places where actually sort of Maasai bombers are. And you can see down here on this, we look on the western side, on the western slopes of the Ngorongoro Conservation from these highlands. This is the areas where you get most of the bombers. And so local communities and villages within that area. And that's the area which actually has been highly impacted. And what's also very interesting is also, one, we think that only just the bombers, but also thinking about the relationship between browsers and grazers to the actually carnivore population. So in Ngorongoro conservation right now, in the western slope here, where these bombers are, there are very fewer carnivores compared to the carnivores in the crater floor, which is also very interesting. And we've been thinking about whether actually sort of overgrazing could be also part of the contributor to the changes in the landscape patterns, which I think it is, and also could be contributed by the fact that actually there are fewer carnivores, which actually putting checks and balances to the other wildlife. And then here we can actually sort of look at it and see some of these changes as well, even more. And here we see that little blob here, and this is the area close to the Olduvai Gorge site. And this is an area which is much more vulnerable right now. And we think that probably the Ngorongoro conservation will have to make some dramatic decisions, have to make some decisions and maybe implement a program which actually sort of maybe by moving some of the communities and the bombers, which actually have been expanding within the area, also encroaching the archaeological sites. So I was actually sort of trying to talk about some of the observed changes. We have actually seen some increased changes, especially since 1926. 1926, with dramatic increase in dwellings, and also which correlates with actually sort of also dramatic changes in the landscape pattern within the western part of the Ngorongoro Highlands. And that we contribute, I think that's attributable to the fact that these are actually either part of the true sort of anthropogenic or a combination of both anthropogenic and climate change, because the Ngorongoro conservation, actually sort of the western part of the conservation actually receives very little rains. So it's actually in the rain shadow. So they get all these orographic rains, but actually they're very few. And in the last, since 2016, there have been some drastic sort of changes, and the area has become much more drier. And of course, with an increased number of livestock within the area now. And so overgrazing also has become one of the biggest problems. And actually, we have reported that at Laitori footprint site, where actually sort of one of the localities, archaeological localities, have been pulverized by goats and cows. So these are actually some of those issues and problems the Ngorongoro conservation is facing right now. And this was actually my last slide. And I apologize for the fact that actually those slides were not advancing, even though I was in a presentation mode. Thank you very much.
That's okay. You described that very well. And I think, yeah, following up with the slides and letting people, take their time to go through them and see the narration and so forth. I think that would be really valuable.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have time now for some discussion, I believe.
Doug, I'd come in on your question about global warming processes uniform all over the world. And although I think Professor Gonzalez would probably be from a scientific perspective could probably answer this better than I. But one of the things that we've noticed in projects that we've been running at ICOMOS in general is the need to focus on climate literacy, actually understanding the modalities of climate change. And in many ways, one of the most important things that I think we as heritage professionals need to do is to make friends with our local climate scientists. Because really responding to hazards is all about understanding what those hazards are, and also understanding that, you know, the future is not set. There are different emission scenarios, there are different possibilities, and we have to plan and do our adaptation based on those scenarios and based on set timeframes. So I think that, like, what we have found in our research is one of the key things is communicating those aspects to the wider audience, and not just speaking about climate impacts in quite general terms, which I think sometimes we can be guilty of in the heritage sector.
My impression of this is not my field, but I've been talking a lot to oceanographers and people who are dealing with Pacific decadal oscillations and larger oscillations across the Pacific, which is evidently a big driver of climatic episodes all over the world, certainly in the land masses around the Pacific, but even beyond that. And it's interesting to me that one idea is that it would not necessarily be that the entire world at one time would increase in temperature, because what happens along the equator, I've worked in Peru, I'm in Peru right now, and I've worked in the Western Pacific. It's almost like what happens in the Western Pacific is different from what happens in the Eastern Pacific, and it's kind of a teeter-totter thing. There's some speculation among the oceanographers that I've been talking to at NASA that what's happening is the teeter-totter swings are getting greater and greater, number one, and also less predictable. I don't know, you know, again, I'm not a climatologist or an oceanographer, but I'm just wondering if that might not be something that explains why, even though in general we've got global warming, it doesn't really show up in certain places. It will be very hot in some places, but maybe not as hot. In others, it might even be cooler. Maybe the precipitation is less than you would expect or more, because it's a very complex system that would be very difficult for people to understand. But I would defer to the experts here on the panel as to whether or not there's anything to those ideas.
You know, the spatial patterns of temperature and precipitation change due to human-caused climate change do vary widely around the world. Specifically, you're talking about the Pacific Douglas, and you mentioned the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, but also the El Nino Southern Oscillation. Those are interdecadal climate cycles that are natural. Right, so about every 5 to 7 years, El Nino occurs, and then the converse, La Nina occurs, and those are natural cycles that are due to the great energy capacity of the oceans. So what climate change does is it raises the baseline under which those natural cycles occur. So even if in a La Nina year, certain areas of the Pacific are cooler than average, the baseline has increased. And so that explains some of what you're asking.
I'm just wondering, yeah, so that's exactly right. But if you raise, I don't know exactly what would happen if, you know, on a global basis, the average temperature is going up, right? And so that might be expressed or it might be felt in certain parts of, let's say, the Pacific. And there may be something else that triggers in another part of the Pacific so that it's cooler than it might be otherwise. You know, more or less kind of
there are the world has experienced very few areas of statistically significant cooling, and the ocean is similar. When we take the ocean waters as a whole, as I showed in my presentation, sea surface has temperature has increased globally 1.2 degrees Celsius since 1910, and global mean surface temperature has increased about 1 degree Celsius. And we do have a few areas of no change or slight cooling, but very, very limited in extent. So overall, the land and sea surface of the world have increased in temperature significantly.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just wondering, how that upsets the natural equilibrium that you're talking about.
I think the other thing, one of the other things, Doug, on this is, as an archaeologist, we often hear the story that climates have always changed. And it's a very dangerous, It's a very dangerous narrative. We need to be quite careful of. So, where I'm based in Northwest Europe, we have periods like the medieval warm period, but it was a regionally focused event, and that's where I think Professor Gonzalez's point on mean surface temperature is so important. That in history we see regional changes, but as a whole, the temperature is heating up just to scary, terrifying levels, especially under some of the more advanced predictions. And so kind of communicating difference between those past changes and present changes, I think, is one of the things we need to do as archaeologists. We need to inherit people. We need to say, look, it's different. It's not what happened in the past. It's totally different,
Well, it's totally different because in the last 40 years, the world's population has doubled. We're living in a different universe. All of those people, buying cars and developing along the coastline, everything that people do. There are twice as many people now as there have ever been in the world. As of like the last 40 years, of course, something's going to go out of whack. You just can't introduce that sort of thing, especially when every one of those people is using technology to a certain extent. So this is nothing. This has got to be it's completely unprecedented. This kind of alteration in the numbers of people on Earth. Of course, we're headed towards something that's not going to be good.
Yeah, and Doug, you're absolutely right. Particularly people in Africa, especially now, my experience is actually dealing and working with people out there. They are seeing the impact of climate change, and actually their communities now which actually been forced to move, actually because of some drastic changes, and where they used to be living, it's not sustainable anymore, and people cannot, and so they move, and I think that's another danger which we're actually probably not talking about it. Some of the impact, climate migrants. It's going to be another thing too, which is very big. And I think with the population increase and all that, and so they're going to be a lot more. And also when you think about World Heritage Sites and all that, and the impact which actually this Ngorongoro is a very good classic example in which actually seen from the 70s, literally population has doubled, and it was supposed to actually remain at least about 30 to 40,000 people. And now there are over 70,000 people, and you can actually see a lot of them now are building permanent homes, buying cars. I mean, you're talking about affluence and all that. And of course, that changes the landscape. And then, of course, when you look at sites which are on the shores of Lake Victoria, those sites, both on the Tanzanian side and the Kenyan side, water level has increased very recently in a sort of dramatic increase in the water level. on the Lake Victoria, and people actually sort of have been forced to relocate. So all of this it's critical to actually sort of looking at sort of climate perturbations and how that affects people in various parts of the world.
Yeah, and you're losing a lot of snow on Kilimanjaro. Here in the Andes, that's all I've been hearing. I've just been hearing, from traditional leaders that they were in their lifetime, they see the snowpack disappearing, and they're very upset by it. And they're not upset at depending where they live and how remote they are from communication networks. They're not blaming the United States or China or anybody else. They just know that the snowpack is disappearing and something's wrong. So, something's wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And for Mountain Kilimanjaro especially, what the biggest impact of that is that that snowpack was actually water reservoir for communities living on the slopes. So underground streams, which actually sort of feed the rivers, are also drying. So you're getting some water shortage as a result of that. So it's all connected to that.
Yeah, it's complex.
So, Douglas, you've posed the major challenges confronting us, and through this session, we've highlighted two types of responses, and one are adaptation responses, which is just trying to reduce the potential risks. But the fundamental solution to climate change is reducing the carbon pollution that causes climate change. And next week, the countries of the world are meeting to offer their national commitments to this. And in a small way, U.S. World Heritage Sites contributes. Superintendent Palfrey talked about the climate-friendly parks program, through which the U.S. national parks reduce their own climate pollution and are doing their part. And for example, Golden Gate National Recreation Area in California has actually reduced their emissions 35% and went climate neutral. So World Heritage Sites can both illuminate the different ways to adapt to climate change, but also be leaders in reducing the carbon pollution that causes climate change.
I don't think I could have said that better. That is exactly what we think we would like to accomplish in this regard with World Heritage Sites. As most examples, and we can see what's happening to those sites, and that's very visible to the public, and also taking action at the World Heritage Sites that hopefully will percolate out to communities and the rest of the population of the world. We have some hope there. Something. It helps. I think it can help. Anyway, thank you. That's great. All right, so with that, I want to thank you very, very sincerely for this incredible set of presentations and the questions that we received that I'd like to follow up on. I would love to be in direct contact with some of you because I think that the issues that we're facing with World Heritage Sites would very much benefit from your counsel. So thank you so much. And it's been a great pleasure to talk with you and of course, very enlightening. So thank you and have a great rest of the day. Join us if you can in the next session.
Thank you.
All right.